Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our final match of the day. My name is Mabel Rourke. I am psyched to finally be on the mic here for Sootopolis City League, joined by Kira. Kira, I think this is going to be a really interesting match between a couple of really dynamic players.
Oh, absolutely. I'm very excited to see these matches. Both of these players are incredibly accomplished in their own rights. And this is going to be a decisive match between the Celtics of Torquil and the Castelia Copers, because if the Copers are able to take this match, they will be able to tie up the week. Whereas if the Celtics win, they will be able to decisively win the week.
Yeah, and those ties are all important, right? Because you still want to get some points on the board for these pool and team type formats. Whereas if you win, if you are, if you're part of the Celtics of Torquil and you get that win, you're ensuring that the Castelia Copers do not get a single point for this week's matchups, and that can be absolutely huge moving in, especially when you're dealing with things like tiebreakers. And I think it's especially important too when you're looking for kind of moving forward into a bit of a format to try and get a good start early on and continue to carry that momentum throughout the rest of the format, especially because this is only week 2. This is just the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting to note that the Copers were actually up in sets this week, but the Torquils were able to rally and bring that back. Now they are leading the Copers to 4-3.
Yeah, and if you look right now between these two players, it is going to be between Teka VGC and AuraRayquaza. And Kira, if you want to get us started off with Teka as a player, go for it.
Oh, absolutely. Teka is no stranger to draft leagues, and they're also no stranger to IRL events. They were a Day 2 world competitor in 2022. Of course, they got top 64 at both the internationals this year, which is nothing to sneeze at. This is not their first rodeo when it comes to draft leagues. I'm very interested to see how they match up into AuraRayquaza.
Yeah, AuraRayquaza Taryn Birdie, a really talented player from England, also currently was in the World Cup as well. Also had an incredible top 8 at the North American International Championships this season. His Series 12 team has been everywhere. Top 16 at the European International Championships, so incredibly talented in this format. Also undefeated in the Smogon PL1 with Stoutlands this last year. So again, no stranger to the in real life formats, like you said, but also quite a lot of success in those online formats, which can be a very different playing dynamic. And when you're looking at these two teams, I think you can kind of see why there's so much talent in the team building between these players, but it's so interesting to see things that play in an online format versus an in real life one.
Yeah, and I'm so pleased to see that both of these players kind of identified the meta, and they said, well, what can I do to still be a little bit original, but also mitigate those threats such as Urshifu, Rillaboom, Incineroar. Neither of those teams have either of those core 3 Pokemon, which is great to see from a casting perspective. I especially love Teka's team with the Hatterene and Didi, making sure that they will be getting up those trick rooms every time. Sunroom was a very beefy, well-known archetype back in the earlier seasons, and I love to see that it's making a comeback.
Yeah, and one thing as well with Terra and AuraRayquaza's team, like you said, it doesn't have any of that standard fire, water, grass core that we're so used to seeing, but it definitely harkens back to the early days of Season 1, Series 2, and Series 3 with the Whimsicott, the Togekiss, and the Dragapult. Those 3 Pokemon were everywhere. The Togekiss was Super Luck and Scope Lens, having a 50% chance to critical hit on every single turn is incredibly tough to deal with. It was tough to deal with in a Dynamax format. I'm sure it's tough to deal with now. But one thing that's interesting to me is having a couple of different options maybe to try and deal with some of those standard big threats and maybe not seeing them nearly as much. I think you have Serena, who is a really interesting Pokemon to carry around in this format, but you're facing against an Indeedee on the opposite side, which is already going to be stopping things like those priority moves. So Serena may not exactly feel too comfortable to come in and may not be able to take advantage of the grassy terrain that a Rillaboom would have set up for it that it could then block. Togekiss and Heatran, they'll look like they're going to be the lead for AuraRayquaza, whereas on Teka's side, it is going to be the Indeedee and Hatterene, so a pretty common lead on Teka's side there.
Yeah, absolutely. And if this Hatterene is carrying that Focus Sash, there is really no way for AuraRayquaza to prevent Teka from setting up Trick Room. And both of his Pokemon are pretty speedy, pretty middling speed tiers, but compared to the Indeedee and the Hatterene, they're quite fast in that department.
Yeah, Hatterene, one of those Pokemon that truly wants to run as slow as possible. Typically, you see them at an absolutely minimal speed. The Indeedee covering for a follow me as well definitely helps to set up a trick room that the Hatterene would love to see, but a heat wave from the Heatran is going to hit both of those Pokemon, no follow me required, and a dazzling gleam from the Togekiss also covers for that follow me, brings these Pokemon down incredibly low and double. There we go. That's definitely confirming, right, that's that Super Lux Scope Lens with a double critical hit on the Indeedee and Hatterene. Going to see instead an expanding force from the Hatterene. No trick room this turn, but that still does a ton of damage onto both of those Pokemon.
Incredibly interesting to see Teka not going for the Trick Room here, because that Togekiss potentially might be carrying that Air Slash, and with Togekiss outspeeding every single turn, there is a massive potential for those flinches. Even though the Togekiss is the Super Luck variant, it's still a 30% chance to flinch.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And oftentimes when you see that Super Luck variant and you have that opportunity to go for those flinches, you'll sometimes see it with that Serene Grace ability. So it definitely is one of those Pokemon with a couple of different abilities that do different things. But when you're running something trying to get those critical hits, having those double targeting moves can be absolutely huge. And I mean, at this point as well, sending the Togekiss out does make some sense, because you're trying to protect it, knowing that if you send you take another sort of expanding force, you could get knocked out at this point. A Protect from the Indeedee going to be stopping all moves from coming at it from this Heatran on the opposite side of the field. Heatran looking like it went instead for another Heat Wave, does target into this Hatterene, does connect, so no misses here, and is able to knock out that Hatterene before it was able to take any knockouts of its own or set up something like Trick Room. And again, also didn't mention this on that last turn, but that Life Orb being revealed on the Heatran as well.
Very interesting to see a Life Orb variant Heatran. I think that's a great idea. Most players are opting for a Shuka Berry. Well, we're opting for a Shuka Berry in a Dynamax format, or back in even BDS or Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl format. So it's very interesting to see a more offensive Heatran potentially picking up those big knockouts, as we did see with the Heat Waves onto that Hatterene.
Yeah, Hatterene getting knocked out and having to send in this Lilligant. Lilligant is not a Pokemon that's going to want to take a Heat Wave, and consistently going for these Follow Me's in the face of a Pokemon with a double target can be pretty tough here, though. Looks like instead that there was my goodness, I'm struggling with that move there. However, the Focus Sash, the Focus Sash being activated from that Heat Wave, Indeedee does get knocked out as well, so that Gastrodon was not able to maybe get exactly the move, the damage that it wanted, but this Icy Wind will help to finish off this last bit of Focus Sash, and AuraRayquaza has immediately taken an incredibly strong lead without revealing a whole lot of information.
Yeah, massive tempo over on the side of AuraRayquaza, and with just this poor Torkoal in the back, I'm not sure what Teka can do for this game one to bring it back. I think at this point, his biggest thing is he wants to fish for as much information as possible. Of course, Torkoal sitting at the sun. If Lilligant was still around, she would be able to take advantage of that with her Chlorophyll ability, but it looks like Teka will just be forfeiting this game one.
Yeah, I mean, you can click Eruption, you can go for it, but at this point it's probably better just to preserve that last bit of information. Make sure that there aren't any attacks going into your own Torkoal, so they can maybe see how strong it is, how bulky it is, depending on maybe how fast it goes, especially in comparison. Because if you're dealing with some Pokemon on the opposite side of the field that may just want to try and kind of get that little bit of information, especially. One thing I think that's really interesting is Teka was bringing two Pokemon that are constantly seen paired together, right? You have Lilycole, which is the Lilligant Torkoal, and the Indeedee Hatterene, also known as Psyspam. So by putting both of them together, you've kind of forced your team into this two mode where you almost would maybe rather take a double knockout once your Trick Room has ended, and then send in something that can take advantage of the speed by, but you know, it becomes a little bit difficult, because if you're not getting those knockouts right out early in the game, then you're already on a back foot and you're already taking too much damage to come back from.
Absolutely, and I'm very excited to see how both players adjust. Mostly Teka. I'd like to see him potentially going for that Trick Room mode, potentially shutting down that sweep by the Heatran and the Togekiss. It was just too oppressive, too much tempo swung in AuraRayquaza's favor.
Yeah, and that's kind of the power, right, of those double targeting moves in the face of a Pokemon like Indeedee. You don't feel the threat of the Follow Me, and every time that Indeedee clicks Follow Me, it's not doing something else. It's not going to try and help out with an expanding force of its own. It's not going to be providing any extra support in a way that's going to be helpful to the Hatterene next to it, because when you're taking things like a Dazzling Gleam and a Heat Wave, one, you're dealing with the crits now from this Togekiss. You have that confirmed, but then you also have the possibility of something like a burn, and knowing that the Focus Sash is on that Lilligant as well, if you can get a Heat Wave burn on there. You don't even have to hit it with an Icy Wind that may not be fully accurate. Interesting as well to see the Icy Wind on the Gastron instead of something like an Ice Beam. I think that's a great move option, especially in Series 8, because speed control can be so important without the opportunity for something like a Max Airstream, especially, you know, and that was one of Togekiss's favorite things to do way back in the day, in early days of 2020, which, God, feels like 18 years ago at this point.
But it's interesting to see Togekiss come back, and it looks like we are getting back into that game too. Let's see some adjustments. Let's see these players maybe bring something different in the lead.
Yeah, Whimsicott is going to be coming out first, paired with that Dragapult, and Dragapult is a super fun Pokemon. Indeedee Stakataka, you're pretty happy to not see that Fairy typing on the opposite side of the field. The Stakataka as well, I think, is a really nice opportunity maybe to get some big damage off onto this Whimsicott, but then you still have to maybe deal with the threat of Trick Room, and there isn't really any sort of option for Taunt that I can kind of see coming right out of the gate. This Dragapult has the opportunity as well to maybe just get some big damage off if it goes for those Dragon Darts, getting some double target damage off because you don't really have that threat. But if you let Teka get up into Trick Room, you're gonna be struggling because you don't have anything that can kind of slow the pace of the game down except for maybe that Heatran in the back or the Gastrodon, and even then those don't love facing down in front of a Stakataka. Looks like we're going to be seeing a U-turn from that Dragapult to get out of the way.
Massive damage onto that Indeedee, and it's very funny to see that Whimsicott Dragapult lead because, as we were saying earlier, speaking of 2020, that was a very popular combination back in the early days of Sword and Shield VGC.
Yeah, and I think the switching here, it makes quite a lot of sense, but the amount of damage that did is making me wonder if that's a choice banded Dragapult, especially when it's running something like that U-Turb. Whimsicott here going for a Moonblast, just going for some straight up damage, targeting down into that Indeedee, gets that full knockout. This does mean that the Stakataka is free to move. It does typically move last, but Trick Room is going to be a great reason to move last. And if you're Teka, you may have not gotten the move that you wanted, whether, you know, you may have not gotten the damage that you kind of wanted to deal, but at this point now you can send in your Hatterene, you have the effect of this Psychic Terrain, you can go for something like an Expanding Force, get that great double targeting damage, and now you have the opportunity to go for something like a Gyro Ball into this Whimsicott, which is a great target for it.
Yeah, absolutely. This Hatterene is sitting so much prettier than it was in game one. The Trick Room is up, its partner is alive. Unfortunately, the Indeedee did have to go down in order for this game state to happen, but Teka is in a much better position than he was in game one, and it does look like the Stakataka is going out into that Gyro Ball, hopefully taking out the Whimsicott, but it does hold on with that Focus Sash.
Yeah, Focus Sash, a pretty standard item there for that Whimsicott, but that Gyro Ball doing a ton of damage, looking like another Expanding Force just to wrap up that Whimsicott and do so much onto the Gastron as well. This Hatterene, when it's in an environment that it wants to be in, you can see exactly how strong that it is. Gastron looks like it's going to be munching on a Citrus Berry here as well, so that it can get a little bit of that HP back. Going for an Earth Power into the Stakataka does a ton of damage, is a full one-hit knockout as well onto the Stakataka. That Stakataka was not allowed to get a Beast Boost up. It was not allowed to become a real threat, and now you're forced to send in your final Pokemon if you're Teka, and I don't think you're too happy losing your Stakataka in Trick Room.
That was truly insane to me because in my mind, Stakataka, you know, Steel type, very bulky Pokemon. Gastrodon, more of a defensive piece, more of a special wall, chanking hits, dealing a little bit of damage, but nothing like that. Oh my goodness. It does give Teka that switch into Lilligant, but in Trick Room, it's not exactly in a position that it would like to be.
Yeah, facing down this Dragapult on the opposite side. Dragapult, one of the faster Pokemon in the format. It can move pretty quickly, which is not great in this particular environment. It has the opportunity to maybe take a couple of strong attacks here. It could maybe get Sleep Powdered from this Lilligant, because this Lilligant, I believe, will move slower without that Chlorophyll, so it will move faster than... So then it will move faster at this point. Hatterene, another Expanding Force, just doing exactly what it wants to do. Gastrodon not going to be able to hang on, and neither is that Dragapult. So you're going to be kind of hanging out here without those two options. Trick Room can absolutely show why Hatterene can be so difficult. A Sleep Powder not going to connect onto any Pokemon, as there is nothing to target on the opposite side of the field.
Absolutely. A Hatterene in Trick Room is such an impressive offensive piece, and I do believe that Lilligant has a little less speed than this Heatran. Hopefully its Sleep Powder will be able to connect this time around, mitigating the potential Steel-type move into Hatterene. It doesn't have anything like a Berry, unfortunately, because it is carrying that Twisted Spoon, as we did see, which is why these Expanding Forces are so much more oppressive than I'm so sorry, I lost my words as I see this Lilligant getting taken down with Focus Sash by that Heatran. So I was incorrect. The Lilligant is actually faster than the Heatran, but slower in Trick Room.
Yeah, but it does get that sleep powder off, but that miss on the Hatterene was huge, and you were definitely fishing for a burn there between either of those Pokemon, really. It would have been helpful, and then, like, that's Terran's way of getting out of this match, is you get this heat wave off, you hit both of the Pokemon, you avoid the sleep powder, and then you can go for it on that next turn. It definitely makes it a little bit tougher. I think there's not really much of a chance for him to kind of get out of here. No way to protect through any sort of last turns of Trick Room. You've already, as well, your item is a Life Orb, so every time you go for it, you're going to be losing HP. So now you need to make that adjustment, right? Because we saw exactly how tough it was to get that Trick Room up and how much Teka prioritized it. And so at this point, you have to imagine that maybe if there is another Indeedee lead, if you send something in that can get that full one-hit knockout onto the opposite Pokemon, and then maybe something that can continue to do damage to the stack attacker, or maybe even if you lead in your Gastrodon, then you can probably put pressure on that stack attacker right away. Because Gastrodon does do so well in those Trick Room environments, it's not very speedy in comparison to some of its partners, and I think Whimsicott may just not even want to come because we didn't see Taunt revealed whatsoever. Actually, Psychic Terrain, so that, negates the whole purpose.
Fair enough. Especially with Hatterene having that Magic Bounce ability, if it were to go for any sort of taunt or status move whatsoever, it would just be completely shut down. What's most interesting to me is how quick these past two games were. Both players, once they get themselves into that perfect offensive board position, they are just ready to take knockouts left, right, and center. So I'm very interested to get into this game 3 to see how both of these players adjust.
Yeah, I think if you're Teka, then you probably don't want to change too much, right? You saw that it worked, even having your Pokemon in the back. Taking that knockout on your Indeedee just allowed for the Hatterene to come in early, and then that allowed for you to just start kind of steamrolling knockouts. Your Hatterene came in without any damage. Makes sense to see it once again on this turn, facing off against that Gastrodon and the Dragapult. Dragapult, we saw that U-turn did so much damage, and if that is choice banded, then that does consistently add threat, and it can target down into the Hatterene as well and do even more damage. And because we know, I think, the Focus Sash being on the Lilligant, you may want to prioritize getting that damage off onto that Hatterene instead of onto the Indeedee. You may have to still contend with a Follow Me, though, so it may still not even matter if Teka decides that he wants to contain all of that damage onto one side and allow for a Trick Room with the Hatterene.
Absolutely, and although this was the Game 1 lead that Teka did end up losing with, I do believe that if Teka had clicked Trick Room that Game 1, things would have gone much differently. So I'm very interested to see what goes on here. It looks like the U-turn does come out into the Hatterene, landing a critical hit, doing so much damage. Dragapult definitely wanted to get out of here if they do sense a Trick Room coming up.
Yeah, the fact that there was no Follow Me is really interesting, right? Because I almost wonder if there was a different move choice from this Indeedee to maybe try and get something like this is Expanding Force to just try and get some big damage off and help enough chip for the Hatterene maybe in a later turn. Gastrodon, though, looks like it's just going for a sweet old recover, just going to get some of that HP. Oh, actually, that's a Stockpile, forgive me. Stockpile Gastrodon is actually going to be going off first here, and then a Trick Room. So that Stockpile Gastrodon is incredibly interesting to see, trying to get those defense and special defense boosts.
Absolutely, and a stockpiled Gastrodon will be sitting pretty in Trick Room. It will be tanking these Expanding Forces from this Hatterene, although the Indeedee is still alive to be able to go for that helping hand. So I'm interested to see, even with that +1 special defense, if the Gastrodon will be able to hang on, and it cannot even with that boost.
Yeah, that helping hand is just absolutely devastating at this point. We haven't seen any... Oh, another Heat Wave miss, too, especially on that Indeedee. But you're happier, I think, to get the Hatterene off of the field. The Indeedee can help out, though. It does have the opportunity to continue to click Helping Hand. This Heatran probably has one more attack left in it before it gets knocked out by its own Life Orb recoil. If you're Terran and you have the Pokemon you have in the back don't have an access to protect, then you're probably going to be in a tougher spot, right? Because this Torkoal can just click Eruption and target down all the Pokemon on the opposite side of the field. Togekiss is another Pokemon that I think is going to really need access to protect this turn, try and stall out some of these moves. Heatran's Heat Wave is boosted at this point, but it's not going to be able to get that move off before the Torkoal, because the Torkoal is going to be the slower in the Trick Room environment.
Absolutely, and I did see that this Torkoal does have access to a ground-type move, presumably Earth Power. Heatran does have Flash Fire as its ability, so if the Torkoal were to hit an Eruption into the Heatran, if it were still alive, if for some reason the Indeedee didn't pick it off, it would be able to fire off a boosted heat wave, but I think the Indeedee did go for that expanding force. Presumably, will be taking out the Heatran this turn, removing one of the biggest offensive threats over on AuraRayquaza's side of the field. Of course, there is still that Togekiss with the ability to crit, but its Dazzling Gleam isn't going to do very much into this Fire-type Torkoal.
Togekiss protects this turn, though, just to continue to stall out some of these turns of Trick Room. You're going to at least need a double. Heatran also showing that it's carrying Protect, going to help to stall out at least one of these turns. You have the opportunity now to maybe go for a double Protect. You can save at least one of these Pokemon, possibly, if you get the opportunity. Indeedee's Expanding Force will not go through onto either of these Pokemon either. So I think at this point, right, you've kind of put yourself in this position where you have to stall out Trick Room. You don't have a ton of offensive pressure until then. You have a Dragapult in the back, and that's not going to be able to do a whole lot because it's still going to be moving as this one of the slowest thing on the field, maybe, except for, you know, even slower than that Togekiss. You've got, I think it becomes a little bit challenging because if you're looking at it, you still, one, need to get your double protects. Then if you're Heatran, you need to get your double targets. Having these two double target Pokemon is really huge, but two double protect fails is not going to get it for you. Eruption, I believe, going off, going to a hit with the Flash Fire on that Heatran, who's going to absorb that attack, actually showing that it's not Flame Body, interestingly enough. Indeedee getting that Expanding Force off, not worried too much about that Flash Fire on the opposite side of the field, able to just pick up this double knockout, and that is going to force Terran into their last Pokemon, which is that Dragapult we saw turn 1.
Yes, and it's very interesting to see that it was Teka's side of the field that was able to get a crit against a Super Luck Togekiss. But very unfortunate for AuraRayquaza, as now the Dragapult is forced to come in, and as you identified earlier, this Dragapult looks like it is Choice Banded, so no Protect on this Dragapult to potentially stall out Trick Room turns.
Yeah, if it's got something like Dragon Darts, you may be in a decent spot, but I think the Follow Me and Dragon Darts combination is still going to force that Dragon Darts into just the Indeedee instead of hitting both Pokemon. It's been a while since I've had to remember my Dragon Darts mechanic, but this Eruption first is still going to do quite a lot of damage. All of that HP for that Torkoal just showing exactly how strong it is, plus this Expanding Force is going to wrap up this game incredibly nicely for Teka. And yeah, I have to assume maybe that it is a choiced or a locked into item for that Dragapult, the fact that it wasn't able to click something like Protect in that turn, which would have at least been that last turn of Trick Room, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. So at that point, then you could get that Protect. You could go for something like a Dragon Darts or maybe a couple of other moves, depending on exactly what type that it is. And maybe just kind of go for a couple of different options. You know, it is still a, you know, the U-turn at least showing that it's a physical version of that Dragapult as well. So just something to kind of pay attention to. Typically, you'll see Dragon Darts on there. But at that point, I think AuraRayquaza just let that Trick Room run away from him before being able to kind of get a handle and get a lock on it, and really kind of showing the adaptability of Teka, his team, and his gameplay.
Absolutely. Both incredible hyper offense players, and once, as I said earlier, once one of those players gets into their optimal board state, it's just all downhill from there for the other side. But incredible games that we have seen today. GG's both to AuraRayquaza and Teka. Do you have any final thoughts before we throw it back to Evan?
A huge thought, and that is a tie for both the Copers and the Torkoals, which is incredibly important, I think, for both of those teams moving forward. It's a huge win for Teka to help keep his team in the running, especially as these weeks begin to kind of go by faster than you can blink. But, you know, that's kind of my last big thought, and thanks for having me on for today. I'm sure you guys will kill it in that wrap-up for the rest of the stream.